In 2004, Shane Meadows wrote and directed Dead Man's Shoes. The film stars Paddy Considine, who co-wrote the film, starring as Richard, who returns to his hometown after serving as a paratrooper in the British Army. He is accompanied by his younger brother Anthony, who suffers from some kind of mental disability, and is played brilliantly by Toby Kebbell. The purpose of returning to his hometown is to seek revenge on a small group of drug dealers for something that they did to Anthony. It's not known right away what exactly the gang did to Anthony, but as Richard's revenge plays out, he leaves behind a brutal and bloody path of carnage. When it's finally revealed that Anthony, who had been given a cocktail of drugs, was taken out to a remote area and hung by the neck until he was dead, Richard's motives suddenly become very clear, and his actions against Anthony's abusers seem justified. But it's not as straightforward as you might think. Dead Man's Shoes plays out with a clearly defined roles of good versus evil, a hero versus villains. But by the end of the film, suddenly these lines have become blurred and confused to the point where we are left to question who are the heroes and the villains after all. I'd like to start by making a direct comparison between Dead Man's Shoes and the character of Richard to another very famous film, that being Rambo: First Blood and John Rambo. This is most evident in the opening scenes of the film. Both Richard and Rambo are seen wearing green army jackets with a bag slung over their left shoulder, walking down a very long road. Richard and Rambo are both former soldiers who have recently returned from combat. Although with Richard, it's never known what the nature or location of his service was, or what happened whilst he was there. The fundamental difference between the two is motive. Rambo was never looking or planning to do anything to anyone or cause the destruction that he did. Richard certainly is fully aware of what he's about to do. But by the end of both movies, it's obvious, not just to the audience, but to the characters of Richard and Rambo themselves, that they've gone too far. And rather than being strong, all-conquering heroes, they are in fact very broken, fragile, and on some level, very disturbed men who need help. Invoking this image of John Rambo at the start of the film sets Richard up to be seen as the hero. As he and Anthony walk down the road, we are shown very old video footage of the two of them as children. This does two things. It establishes that they are clearly related, and paints Richard as a loving, caring big brother who is protective of his vulnerable sibling. The challenge with a film like this is how to not make it obvious that Anthony does not exist, but also leaving enough subtle clues that you don't notice until you go back and watch the film again. The first clue is that Richard decides to stay in an abandoned farmhouse near the town. This makes sense from his perspective because, as a soldier, he knows how to deal with things like the cold and sleeping outdoors and how to survive in such a situation. But Anthony certainly would not, especially given his disability. For him, being in such a situation would be extremely stressful. You also become aware that Richard only had one bag with him. Where is Anthony's bag? Where are his things? The second clue is the fact that despite appearing in multiple scenes with the gang members, none of them at any point mention or acknowledge his presence. They only ever talk about Richard. Add to this details like Anthony is always seen wearing the same clothes and looks exactly the same in every scene, despite having spent several nights sleeping rough in a farm. Or questions such as when Richard goes out at night to torment and punish the gang, where is Anthony? Surely he wouldn't bring him along, but at the same time you can't leave a severely handicapped young boy alone in an abandoned farm all night. In hindsight, it's obvious that Anthony doesn't exist, because it would be both illogical and cruel for Richard to take him along. But you don't question this when you're first watching the film, and this is largely down to two things. The first is quite subtle. In the second scene of the film, Richard is in a bar with Anthony, awaiting for one of the gang members to walk in. Presumably Richard knows this is where they regularly deal. As one of the gang, known as Herbie, enters the bar, Anthony quickly turns his head and says,
"Ease one, bro."
Richard then turns his chair and proceeds to stare, quite obviously, at Herbie. When Herbie notices this and tries to question Richard,
"Can I help you, mate?"
Sorry?
The fuck are you looking at?
You cunt.
Herbie quickly leaves, And throughout this whole scene, Anthony's head is turned away from Herbie's gaze. This scene gives the impression that Richard didn't know who these dealers were and that Anthony was there to identify them for him. But Anthony doesn't actually do that. He simply says, "Here's one, bruv," which could imply that Richard knew all along who they were. If Richard didn't know who they were, Anthony would more likely have said something like, "That's one, bruv," or "This is one, bruv." Richard grew up in this town after all. He knows full well who these men are. As I would imagine, so does everyone else who lives there. We know this because Anthony never identifies any of the other gang members, and by the next day, Richard has already broken into several of their homes, painted the gang leader Sonny's face, and dyed the hair of another member, Alan. He also shows up at another address where Herbie and two of the other gang members are, wearing a gas mask. This causes them to freak out and run out of the flat, leaving it unattended, whilst Richard sneaks in and steals all of their drugs. The second reason you don't doubt Anthony's existence is down to the brilliant acting skills of Tony Kebbell. If this performance was given in a more mainstream movie, this would have been a shoo-in for an Oscar and pretty much every other award he could have possibly qualified for.
What, them little lines in your hair?
What, them? You did them.
I certainly did not.
You did.
No, I didn't.
When you cut it.
I try and look like a gangster.
No, I'm going to grow it anyway.
What, you growing it like?
Dunno, long hair.
Like Bon Jovi?
No.
It's a testament to how great a performance he puts in that a very common response people give is how they thought that Anthony was actually being played by an actor who genuinely suffered from some kind of mental impairment in some form. The only question that is now left for us is, what did the gang do to Anthony that has prompted Richard to return and seek revenge? After making his presence in the town known to the gang, they all get in Sonny's car and go out in search of Richard. This doesn't take them very long, as they quickly come across him standing by a fence in the middle of a housing estate. This isn't a coincidence. Richard knew this would happen. He knew they would all go to Sonny's house in the morning, that they would all go out looking for him, and he knew they would have to drive down this road at some point if they were going to go to the town. In what is possibly the most famous scene in the film, Sonny confronts Richard about his antics the previous night. It's here we see how terrified Sonny and the gang are of Richard. They know what he is capable of doing to them and that he is highly motivated and determined to do it. Richard is also aware of this, which is why he goes on to explain to Sonny exactly what he's going to do to him and the rest of the gang, and he even advises them to get away and leave as soon as possible.
You make me very nervous, Richard. Well, you should be. If I were you, I'd get in that fucking car and I'd get out of here, man. I'd gather them goonies and get whatever you've got and come with me. Because I'm gonna fucking hit you all.
It's possible that Richard wanted to give them a chance to leave because he knows it's the only way he can be stopped from doing what he's about to do. Or maybe he just wanted to toy with these men and make them live in fear of someone more powerful and cruel than they are. We are treated to several flashbacks throughout the film, depicting the day the gang did something to Anthony. We see them give him alcohol, weed and then acid. They then proceed to coerce a woman who they hang around with to take Anthony to bed and have sex with him. We see Sonny threatening Anthony, seemingly trying to make him perform an act of oral sex on him. And when Anthony refuses, Sonny decides to hit and smack Anthony around. This leads you to conclude that some kind of sexual abuse must have occurred between Anthony and the gang. Abuse that we have yet to be made aware of. Because as vile and as cruel as the gang are and behave towards Anthony in these flashbacks, does it really justify Richard murdering all of them? Despite knowing that Richard is gonna, quote, hit them all, and him even giving them the chance to escape, they don't. They choose to stay. That night, whilst they're sat around playing cards and discussing what to do, Richard strikes. When one of the members leaves to go to the toilet, Richard kills him with an axe and uses his blood to write the words "one down" on the wall. The crucial detail here is that at no point during this entire scene do we see Richard. All we see is the gang member's blood-soaked body, which one of the others discovers in the toilet. The next morning they all drive to the abandoned farm Richard is staying at with a plan to take him out. The plan is for one of the gang members, Alan, to lure Richard out into the open so that Sonny, who is parked away at a distance, can shoot him using a telescopic lens. However, things go badly wrong. Sonny panics. He shoots too early and accidentally kills Alan. They drive off as Richard stands there smiling with his arms open. These first two kills establish not only how dangerous Richard is, but how incompetent and out of their depth the gang are. They're not the big tough gangsters they thought they were. They're small-time crooks in an even smaller-time town. They've had it easy until now. Following the botched shooting, one of the gang members, Tough, he decides he wants to get away and advises that the others do so too. But they don't. The three remaining members, Soz, Herbie and Sonny, go back to Sonny's house that night. They scour the house to see if Richard is there, but can't find him. However, Richard is already there, hiding underneath the staircase. When the coast is clear, Richard sneaks into the kitchen and empties out the bag with all of the drugs he stole 2 nights ago into the kettle. He then hides in wait. Eventually the gang make a cup of tea and proceed to lose their grip on reality as their bodies and minds deal with the cocktail of speed, ecstasy and acid that they've consumed. Eventually Richard enters the room, but the gang are too high to do anything about it. Richard first drags Sonny into the kitchen and promptly shoots him in the head. He then quickly kills Soz with an upward palm strike. He then sits down with Herbie and reveals a suitcase containing the body of Tough, who he's killed earlier, and tells Herbie that he will let him live and let him go as long as he gives him the address of Mark, the final gang member. Herbie tells Richard where Mark lives, but doesn't know the full address. Richard says that's fine. He'll find him anyway. He then proceeds to kill Herbie, despite saying he wouldn't. The first kill in the movie occurs at 37 minutes, and Herbie is killed around about the 58-minute mark. That's only 20 minutes for the 7 gang members that we know of to die. So within under the hour mark of a 90-minute film, the 7 villains are already dead. Dead Man's Shoes is a 90-minute film, meaning there's obviously something else has to happen. And it's at this point the movie's real story begins to unfold. Mark is not a character that we have been made aware of until Richard mentions him. Because had we known of Mark's existence prior to this, that would have distracted us from the actual revenge narrative, which is the actual distraction from the real story. Mark is the only member of the gang who has quite clearly moved on and escaped from the life as a small-time drug dealer. He has clearly also cut all of his ties with the gang members and wants nothing more to do with them. The fact that none of the gang mentioned him at any point suggests that A, they don't care about him, B, this happened a long time ago, and that they don't really know how to contact him anyway. Mark is now living a very normal life. He has a wife, 2 young sons, and a nice house, and a full-time job. Unlike the other gang members, Mark is not the man he used to be. But then, neither is Richard. Something that is brought up in an earlier scene where Sonny says,
It's that simple. I saw him. I looked us right in the eye and he ain't the same guy that left.
We see Mark's 2 young sons leaving the house, and when they return, one of them is wearing Richard's gas mask and the other is holding a knife. When their mother asks where they got them from, they say, a soldier who is a friend of Dad's. Richard then quickly shows up at the house shortly afterwards, claiming to be an old friend of Mark's. He tells her that he met her sons and that they were, quote, absolutely brilliant lads, which he says whilst smiling for the only time in the film. And it's not a smile of a sick and sadistic killer, but one of someone who is genuinely happy. When Mark returns home, his wife is waiting for him and asks him who is Richard and why is he here. It's at this point we learn that the gang had killed Anthony and that he's been dead this whole time. This means that all this time Richard has been seeing Anthony. He's not just a vigilante seeking revenge. He's a very disturbed and troubled man. He is not very well. Early the next morning, Mark, who has been forced to sleep on the sofa the whole night, is woken by Richard. Richard makes Mark drive him at knife point to the exact location Anthony died. Richard asks Mark,
Why him? Because he was weak. Because he was a spastic.
He wasn't a spastic.
He fucking was a spastic.
I cut my jaw. Will you cut my tail off my jaw? It was a fucking nana.
He looked up to you.
Well, he was a fucking embarrassment to me.
This is where we see the true nature of Richard and Anthony's relationship. What we thought was one of a loving and caring pair of brothers was actually one of resentment and a forced sense of obligation. Richard's use of the word spastic and the very cruel impression of Anthony are not delivered in an irreverent and affectionate way. They are clearly malicious. I'm sure this isn't the first time he's done them either, whether it was to Anthony's face mocking him or doing it behind his back with his friends. But this is something the film alludes to in an earlier scene in which Richard is sat, clearly alone, but talking to Anthony.
Do you remember when you came to our school and did that run, Richard?
I do, yeah.
Good day that was, wasn't it? You was the best. You earned the most money, didn't you?
About 300 quid, I think.
Do you remember when you played football?
I do, yeah.
You was the best then as well, weren't you?
Who was that little lad who kept showing his arse whenever he got the ball?
That's Michael Parks.
They just wanted to hold my hand, didn't they, mate?
Yeah, didn't they? They all held your hand. I didn't.
No, you didn't.
Don't need to, do I?
Anthony's line, "I don't need to, do I?" suggests that this isn't something that he has decided himself. It's what he's been told to do by Richard. Richard has clearly said to Anthony, "You don't need to hold my hand," because he doesn't want to be seen holding Anthony's hand. I suspect that he only went to the school sports day in the first place so he could play with the other lads of the same age and know what it felt like to have a normal little brother.
What did you fucking do, not them cunts?
Didn't stop it. Didn't stop it.
Well, I wish you had. Because you'd have stopped a lot of carnage.
Notice that he doesn't say, "because that was my brother and I loved him." He simply says, "you would have stopped a lot of carnage."
I love you, kid, but I can't do it. I can't do it. I'm sorry.
This obviously means that he is still seeing and hearing Anthony and is speaking to him. And the way he phrases it actually implies that this is what Anthony wants him to do. He's apologising to Anthony because he can't kill this man. He can't bring himself to do it. He is doing this because Anthony wants it. That doesn't really sound like something Anthony would really want. Richard is projecting his own desires through a vision of Anthony. Richard is seeing these visions of his brother who he believes wants him to kill people. Now, I'm hesitant to play armchair psychologist here, but it's more than likely Richard is suffering from some form of psychosis, probably along with PTSD from something that happened whilst he was serving in the military. Despite what we've been led to believe, he is not going to stop killing once he has finished with all of the gang members, and Richard knows this. He uses the small grip on reality and the tiny bit of self-awareness he still has left and asks Mark to kill him with his own knife. Richard tells him,
Please, I don't know what else I'm capable of doing.
as images of Richard playing with Mark's kids appear implying that Richard will come after and kill Mark's children. But Richard doesn't want to harm Mark's children. Why would he? They have made him smile for the first time probably in years since he returned from service. They gave him that joy that he had of having a little brother again. The joy that he never really experienced the way he wanted. And they themselves will have the sort of relationship with each other that he has been denied with his brother. He doesn't want to hurt them, but he's slowly losing control to the point where he can't guarantee that he won't. Mark reluctantly shoves the knife in Richard and leaves him to die, and finally he can lay with his brother in peace. He now has to get on with his life, or at least try to, whilst carrying the burden of everyone else's sins who has passed him by on his shoulders, the same way you would if you were wearing a dead man's shoes. He's probably the character who by the end of the movie is worse off than the others. They were never going to change. Richard was never going to change. Mark, on the other hand, has a life and a family and everything to lose, and it's reasonable to believe that he probably will. In the end, there are no heroes, there are no villains, nobody wins, no justice is served. All that is left is Mark walking away, hands bloody, wearing a dead man's shoes. Thank you.